the 90s were bad for metal. You couldn't make any money, and you couldn't succeed, and the whole press was against you. And we hear these claims over and over again so many times, and it just infuriates me because the fact of the matter is that whoever wanted to withstand and survive the 90s did, and a good number of bands didn't go along with the winds of change and the winds of time, and they did just perfectly fine. And even those who did fall on hard times, they at least did so with dignity, because the fact of the matter is that in those times, the media, the music machine, the music industry machine simply rejected whatever was considered old and from the 80s and stupid and heavy metal and glam metal. But there is so much um, lies and manipulation regarding this. First of all, my biggest claim against all of these people, these complainers, is that number one, the writing was on the wall, and in fact, many seen it. So today, whenever this is mentioned, you get the impression that on January 1st, 1990, everything stopped and everything and everybody switched to grunge, and Nirvana came about and they kicked everybody out, and it was impossible to do anything, which is absolutely untrue, obviously. The turning point from my perspective, the way I understand it, was 1987 with Guns N' Roses. When I listened to Guns N' Roses with my friends in high school, it just sounded to us like another band. To us, there wasn't really a big difference between Guns N' Roses and Whitesnake and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and whatever was famous, or at least from our perspective, what we liked. Was it exactly the same? No. Did we notice that there was a difference in concept or in direction from all of these big glam bands? Maybe to some extent. We didn't really concentrate on that much. Yeah, of course, there weren't all of the synthesizers that a lot of people were complaining about. The sound was a little bit more straightforward and stripped down. But in reality, the biggest change was in attitude, in all of the outwardly, all of everything that's around the music and not the music itself, right? You had Axl Rose with its stupid bandana and the stupid bikinis or shorts, whatever he was wearing on stage. So there wasn't any more leather and studs, that sort of pseudo macho kind of image, right? That a lot of heavy metal bands had, the leather jackets and the spikes and the studs and all of that. But in reality, what they did, they brought another kind of macho. It's like, hey, look at us, we're so macho that we don't have to prove that we're macho. Kind of that sort of mentality. And that went on, and the press, most notably the heavy metal press, the press that adopted, so to speak, or that in many cases that was born and was created from the heavy metal craze, right? You had the magazines like Kerrang and Metal Hammer and Metal this and Metal that and Hard Rocking Crunching, you name it, a bunch of magazines that came into existence just riding on the coattails of the commercial success of heavy metal. So the big reputable and respected publications, whether they were dedicated music publications or lifestyle sort of social, right? The Atlantic, the great magazine of the intellectuals, obviously was always constantly spinning on heavy metal and glam bands, and they adopted the grunge newcomers with open arms, and immediately they became the darlings of the media. But my point was that even in the dedicated heavy metal media, they started to write with scorn and derision of all of the old bands. Of course, Twisted Sister is kind of maybe the most notable example of someone, of a band that was respected and everybody adulated and congratulated them and was at their feet, and on the turn of a coin everybody turned against them and spit on them, And again, I'm not saying that Twisted Sister themselves didn't have anything to do with it, but case in point is that the journalists, the music critics, turned on their their hitherto favorite bands and favorite style of music, not just musically speaking, but the whole scene, and they turned on it. And it didn't happen overnight. There was kind of a long period when I already noticed that there's something here, and that they're always trying to praise the newcomer bands that are not so much. There were some other bands, the all female bands, L7. Ooh, oh my God, how the journalists worship them, right? It's like not even an interesting band. So the writing on the wall was there already, and that's number one. And number two, when good music came, the fans were all for it, right? You had Painkiller released in 1990. There was a big, huge, smashing success. I don't know if from a sales and fiscal perspective, but even today, and in fact immediately when Painkiller came out, you knew and everybody knew, and it was clear that this was going to be an album set in stone for generations. People said it there, people felt it, people who were not into Priest at all listened to that record. You had Ozzy Osbourne, what's the name of that record? Mama, I'm Coming Home. I think there was a song from the record. I forget if that was actually the name of the No More Tears. I'm sorry. Yeah, the record is No More Tears. And then okay, Maiden's 90 record is kind of tanked. They didn't like that. I don't even know if Maiden consciously wanted to follow the trend, but they just wanted to take back a little bit from the synthesizers and the complexity, and make it a little bit drier and more dull and stripped down, maybe. I'm not really sure what was the thinking, right? I'm not a member of the band, so I don't know. But No Prayer for the Dying wasn't a big success. But when they came back, they with the Coming Home to Roost in 1992, which is really where they were, what they should have done in 1990, right? With Fear of the Dark, it was hard and punchy, and it was unquestionably and unabashedly heavy metal. So it's not really true that on the turn of a dime everything changed, but there is some truth to it, because the change came about much slower than in the previous decade, right? When you look at the late 70s, early 80s, the media was kind of slow to catch up, and they waited for the success of the heavy metal bands and the formation of what we typically call the new wave of British heavy metal, and then they jumped on the bandwagon. Plus a lot of the pro heavy metal, or the heavy metal friendly press, came from heavy metal fans themselves, right? First there were fanzines that people were writing, handwriting or typing in the home on a typewriter or early computers, and then Xeroxing, photocopying in a local shop or maybe in the office, and then handing them out, and then they became bona fide official publications. But by the end of the decade, they very quickly turned on the bands that they previously respected. Actually, one term that they loved to use back then, before the term grunge even existed, was Seattle. Everything was Seattle. The Seattle bands, right? Guns N' Roses weren't themselves Seattle, but the adulation and the worship of Guns N' Roses came pretty close or together with this term Seattle. Actually, Queensryche was a Seattle band, ironically, and the journalists love Queensryche. They always, Seattle, they're from Seattle, and they liked the records, which were good. They totally deserved all of the good reviews and the adulations. I loved Queensryche until a certain point. But they were a regular heavy metal band. Like if you look at Queensryche, not as individual albums, but just as a band, the kind of music, it fit in perfectly. Yes, it's American heavy metal, so it's closer to, let's just say, Wasp and Motley Crue than Priest and Maiden, but it's not very far. It's kind of in between. It wasn't super stripped down. If you look how they looked in '86 and maybe even in Operation Mindcrime, they pretty much looked like, not like super glammy. I don't think they had makeup, or maybe just a little bit minimal. The eyeliner, the black around the eyes, it was almost a requirement. But the haircuts and the jackets and all of that, the costumes, that was pretty 80-ish still, and yet the media was all over them. Or a Seattle band, Seattle band. And plus, one thing that I find especially disgusting and repulsive is the retro engineering that came like a decade later, or maybe more than a decade, even to this day. I saw all of these self-important, self-titled media analysts and media specialists and experts who came like Guns N' Roses represented the rebellion and blah blah blah, and the sexual revolution. It wasn't really a sexual revolution. It was about accepting homosexuals, and they put there a picture of this chick with a buzz cut, right, like the Vietnam War era protesters kind of. It doesn't even look like it's really from a Guns N' Roses concert. It might have been, but I don't think that at the time in the late '80s it really represented the average Guns N' Roses concert going. Guns N' Roses toured with AC/DC and Metallica. Or Metallica is another one, right? The Black Album that made them really big and famous, which is kind of a funny story in and of itself. I think I'll talk about it in a future video. But all of this was still going on pretty strong. And then in the early '90s, that's when it came out. There was the big poster with the dollar bill and the little baby trying to catching it, and everybody was all over that. And when I kind of got into that a little bit later, I was kind of late coming because I was into my music, so I didn't find any reason to go into this new kind, and it sort of bypassed me at the time. I wasn't really interested in what was happening then in music. But when later on, when I came to revisit their bands, I'm like, what is this? What are they trying to do? What's all the hype, and and of course that's when all the mid '90s, the early mid '90s were the ones when all of these crazy bands came out. The Alice Addiction and Smashing Jane, or Smashing Heroin, or you get the point. Soundgarden, whatever, these crazy names. There was actually there was another great band that was sort of kind of lumped together, not really, but the media had a lot of adulation for them, and they were the Black Crowes. And the Black Crowes were actually, as a band, music, they were pretty good. It wasn't really heavy metal, but it was definitely not grunge. So you could see that the press already concentrated more on the attitude, because the Black Crowes kind of had that attitude, that anti everything. And I think there was one big hypocrisy, because the industry, the music industry, was becoming then a very, very well-oiled machine, very well organized. Access to studios became a lot cheaper, a lot easier. It was a lot easier to build a studio pretty much anywhere in their home. And what grunge really lacked was authenticity. And the biggest lie, or the biggest propaganda, was that grunge is somehow authentic, that the bands with the makeup, with the big hair and the tight jeans and Poison and Motley Crue and all that crap was inauthentic. But these guys, they are the real authentic, which was, nothing could be further from the truth. They had fake depression, fake anger, fake everything. These were kids that grew up having anything they ever wanted, and kids who had it so good that they didn't even realize how good they had, right? The story goes that this Kurt Cobain was sleeping under the bridge and all of that. He went camping out with a backpack, with a sleeping bag under the bridge. It was all fake. These were all very middle class guys. And again, I have nothing against it. It did happen in the past. It did happen before, in the '70s, right? A lot of musicians, Robert Fripp, Ian Anderson, David Gilmour, some others. I think what's his name, John Wetton, right, when he was in Mogul Thrash. So a lot of these guys were well to do. A lot of guys were from very poor working class families, right? Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Led Zeppelin, these guys, and that they crawled out of the shit on their own with their own effort, but they had a lot of dues to pay. They were piss poor, and they didn't know that they were going to be rock stars. But these grunge guys, they came expected. You owe it to us, and the music industry responded in kind. Yeah, sure, we're gonna make you big stars, and they marketed them as such, and everything was already much more organized than it was in the previous decade, and it all played into the advantage of these grunge bands, and the young crowd was ready and willing to purchase it as such, because they also were in a similar situation. They had pretty much anything they want. They didn't have to work for anything, and these grunge guys came like on the first day. Oh, you owe it to us to be rock stars, and they got it, unfortunately, and they got very brash and very arrogant and very disrespectful to previous bands. Ironically, this is kind of funny, because from all of that group of grunge and all that crap, I think the best band musically, at least the one that I could listen to and get into and enjoy, it was the Manic Street Preachers. And they were the most disgusting. They opened it, they were spitting on Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and all of that, and they said it's not real music and that they're all fake. And they put a lot of social commentary. There was always this social, the so-called activism, this nasty, hardcore, extreme left-wing fanaticism that everything is bad, and they were against capitalism and against the bourgeoisie. And that was so fake, because this is exactly who they were, right? And in reality, there's nothing new about this. This was just a rehash of the late 70s, early 80s alternative scene, right? There were a lot of bands like the Joy Division, whatever, even punk itself, right? The Exploited, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones. It all revolved around the same fakery. But at least they didn't take themselves so seriously. They weren't so condescending and so arrogant. Like when you look at what's the guy's name from the Pistols, the guy who made Public Image Limited, Johnny Rotten. Today, Johnny Rotten, I won't say he's a genius, but he talks fairly intelligently, and when he talks about current events or politics, he doesn't come across as hateful and nasty and condescending. He's pretty knowledgeable, so whatever his ideas are, but he sort of stepped away from all of that group and that kind of mentality. And they all brought their politics to the fore. Again, politics and music and art in general is nothing new. But again, I think I mentioned that in a previous video, that these guys, they demanded the respect of the artist, they demanded the wealth of an entertainment superstar, right? Like football players and basketball players, and they demanded the adulation and the respect of some sort of poet or politician, So on day one, they wanted to have everything. They wanted to be respected as a bona fide artist, like they were some sort of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Beethoven, which they clearly were not. The music is not that good. Yeah, technically there was a big evolution, but that's always the nature of crafts like this, right? Today you can go on YouTube, and you open YouTube and you can see a 12-year-old kid sitting on his bed and doing all this super lightning fast and extremely accurate runs up and down the fretboard, kind of like Ingrid Malmsteen and Steve Vai and Eddie Van Halen, that kind of stuff. So and even in classical music, you hear today orchestras that they're so technically advanced. Again, it's a little bit difficult to attribute this to one factor, but probably because there's so many people vying to get into these places, it became so lucrative that everybody wants that, so that they can pick the best, the technically best. But it's kind of lacking soul. It's lacking the inside, the true feel. So that's number one. And number two, there were the bands who just went through the 90s without looking left or right, as if the whole grunge nonsense never came, right? Take Motorhead, for example. Take Saxon. Take Rush. Take Iron Maiden. These bands never sold out. They never looked left and right. They kept doing what they love doing. Some bands, unfortunately, sold out. Most notoriously, Judas Priest. The even Gary Moore, right? He has two horrible albums from the late '70s, right? Dark Days in Paradise and a different beat, and Priest with the Jerkofader and what's the other's name? The other was slightly better. It was a little bit more thrash, kind of industrial, but it wasn't a back to the roots album. Demolition, defecation, I call it. And most bands just went along with it. Wasp did such a record in the mid '90s. There were Kiss. My goodness, I just spoke about it. Horrible, right? Carnival of Puke, disgusting records. So a lot of bands tried pandering, and it was those who tried pandering were even more inauthentic than the newcomers, the Pearl Jam and the Nirvana style, right? Those were authentically inauthentic. That the people were inauthentic. Their scorn and their derision and their left wing extremism and bringing it out in the open, right? We know most of these people tend to be politically left, but there was one band in particular, the Chicks at Dicks or something, that they stripped naked. It was an all girl band that they put all of these slogans over themselves, and wow, they thought that they were such geniuses. So this tendency was already there from the beginning of the grunge movement. That they brought their politic as if it were an inextricable part and parcel of their music and their art and their craft. And don't get me wrong, sometimes they did good things, although I think that this happened much later on, when I think it was either Pearl Jam or the Food Fighters. I think that one band came out of the other, or it's a side band of the other. As much as I dislike the guy, what the hell is his name, David Grohl, to his credit, he was the one who tried at least to challenge Live Nation and Ticketmaster. But there were other bands with him who had the balls to do this and say we're only going to play venues that are not affiliated with these two monsters. But again, that's kind of a little bit of a different topic. But again, credit where credit is due, and criticism where criticism is due, right? If many other bands would have went along with them, I think that they would have been able to move the needle a little bit. But that's pretty much it. So the industry became like a very, very fake support to make it seem like it's really organic and it's really natural, and it wasn't. It was very, very fake, and the industry was in favor of them and on the bandwagon. And of course, it became even more fashionable for like the big condescending, the pseudo professional, right? There is one magazine that I'm not going to mention the name, but they're named after a very, very famous band, and they consider themselves as the be all end all, the experts on all manners of music and pop culture. And of course, they always have these extreme, horrible, hate-filled, scornful, looking down, derisory articles about current events, and then always spitting on whoever they don't like, and everybody's a racist and homophobe if they don't like him. So this is the story of grunge in a nutshell. And what I can tell you, that these albums will never go down in history like the big classics, right? Like the early Deep Purples and the early like Sabbath and Led Zeppelins. The industry tries, the internet tries. They have these sort of indie magazines. Oh, there was another one. What's the name? The one that Rob Halford collaborated with. Rob Halford also himself tried to make a record like that too. Pretty horrible. But what's Trent Reznor, right? Nine Inch Nails, also trying to present himself like the be all end all, like the epitome of being real. Yeah, I'm for real, and authenticity, and the whole thing is fake. He became famous because he made some sort of a horror movie, as a music video from one of his records, and the whole thing is meaningless. It's just noise. After 5 minutes, you want to put on your ear protection. Ugh. I'll listen to synth pop rather than that. To be honest with you, almost. So this is the story of grunge in a nutshell, and as you would have expected, today there is a revival of more traditional heavy metal, right? I've seen on the internet and new wave of traditional heavy metal. So bands like Night Demon, and there's a lot of American bands. Again, it's not like it's amazing and we never heard about it before, because again, it's tradition. It's picking up a tradition from where it went, but I'm very, very happy that the grunge thing didn't last as long, right? The what is it called? Even today, there's even a revival of those mid '80s bands, right? Listen to Ghost, the Swedish band. Listen to Sabaton, good solid bands. Again, if you don't like it, you don't have to listen. But they're not pandering. They're not pretending. They're not fake. So I think that's kind of refutes the whole argument that the '90s were bad for metal. It's metal was bad for '90s. Big metal bands, all of a sudden didn't have that structure. Okay, that was one of the main points that I wanted to make. That they didn't have that big structure, that big industrial behemoth behind them to support them like they had in the mid '80s, right? So in the late '70s, early '80s, everybody was against them, and they developed that sort of that mentality or that aura of being anti-establishment, and the whole establishment is us, and complaining that the press doesn't give them any kind of recognition, right? The members of Black Sabbath were complaining that famous magazine that I don't want to mention called them drunken bozos. I mean, really, Mr. Geezer Butler, really Tony Iommi, really Ozzy Osbourne. You're surprised that someone would call you a drunken bozo? I mean, that's exactly what they were until the mid '80s when they got sober, right? But anyway, so heavy metal wore kind of this victimhood, or this anti-hero Robin Hood sort of. Oh, we made it big despite the whole establishment and the whole media being against us. And then slowly from the early kind of mid early '80s and on, they made their own press, right? And you had MTV, so they got very, very comfortable in their skin, being super mainstream and super famous, and having it all, and still kind of trying to claim that they're anti-establishment and that they made it despite blah blah blah. Again, for those bands it was true, but then when this machine turned against them and slapped them on their face and spit in the face, they didn't know how to eat it, which is preposterous, because if they were really true to their roots, right? Dio, for example, he was like very big in the metal, and those who truly really believe in the music, and they are not sellouts, blah blah blah. And he himself released at least one record like this, not Angry Machines, Strange Highways, and then maybe also Angry Machines. That was very like that. And Judas Priest made a career of saying that they're flying the banner for heavy metal and the defenders of the faith, and then they sold out completely with Jug. And they could have made good albums. They could have made Hard Edge, make a harder, more like a thrash metal kind of album. Let's just say like a Priest meets Megadeth with Jerkofader and Defecation. They didn't, and more even more unfortunate is that poor what's his name, the singer Ripper Owens, Tim Owens. He got all the blame for it when he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't writing with them. He didn't have a say in the direction that they were going. So they should have gone on a more traditional kind of record. They should have released. Jerkofader should have been what eventually not set Wings of Destiny. Why am I having a brain fart? Angel of Retribution. I'm sorry. Yeah, what Angel of Retribution eventually became. Had they done that, I'm not saying they would have done better commercially, but at least they would have preserved their dignity and their integrity. No one would have look down at them or criticize them for selling out, right? And again, imagine Angel of Retribution, but with Owens or something in that neighborhood, right? That would have been the natural follow up to Painkiller. But again, it's not just against Priest. It's all the bands that didn't sell out. Where here's another one who didn't sell out, Uriah Heep. They kept their head above water, and so did Black Sabbath, to their immense credit. Ozzy Osbourne, he kind of in the mid '90s, he made some records. They weren't outright grunge or industrial, but they kind of mimicked that sound and that mentality. So that's what it is. The '90s were not bad for metal. Metal was bad for the '90s. Metal has always had this sort of renegade and anti-establishment and resistance and making it against the odd. And in the '90s they totally abandoned it. They caved. They folded. They bowed down to the false new idols, to the gods of grunge, and grunge, of course, evaporated with the wind. They are meaningless bands, in my opinion. I know that some people try to revive them, but I think more than musical, it's kind of social, socio-political, right? For example, what's their name? One of these bands, I forgot which one, but Youth in Chains or Sonic Alice or Sonic Jane, whatever. They have a pretty good guitar player, right? From a technical perspective, and you have someone like Rick Beato oohing and eyeing and oozing all over them because probably they're still somehow famous or they still have a little aura about them. But you will never ever catch Rick Beato dead mentioning Black Sabbath or Priest or someone like Frank Gambale. Okay, Pat Metheny, he does. Pat Metheny is not such a pariah, but he would never do such a thing, right? Mention the bands that you don't have to pay. Even I don't even think that he truly ever mentioned Gary Moore or Peter Green or Snowy White. Why? Because that's a little bit contagious. You have to bow down to the big idols. You have to love Lady Gaga and Adele and all of that, and that he's okay too. And by the way, I don't hate the guy. I like the guy. I like his show. I agree with a lot of things that he says, but he plays it super safe, right? He would never in a lifetime ever dare uttering the slightest criticism against the Beatles. But in reality, they were an average band at best, a boys band. All of the adulation for them is fake and false and fabricated, exactly like grunge. But then it was a novelty because they were alone and the market wasn't so saturated. So that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you. It's not true that the '90s were bad for metal. Metal was bad for the '90s, and I'll see you pretty soon in the next one. Until then, rock on and don't never stop.